Today, the Fed and the future. Finance Analytics, welcome to his post covering finance and property news with a distinctively Australian flavour. Today, I'm joined again by George Gammon. Hi, George.
Hey, Martin, what's going on, buddy? It's so great to be back. You know, whenever I'm on Twitter, I get so much feedback from the guys in Australia and the gals in Australia. And there's a few people in particular that say we've got this bromance thing going on. I don't know about that, but I definitely enjoy talking to you.
Well, we have a really good chat. I think partly because we're both relatively open and honest about what's going on, right? What I find really interesting, George, is there are a lot of YouTube channels who have a very myopic view and keep pressing that view, you know, gold is the way to go or whatever, right? There are very few people who can take a broader perspective, and I think it's really important in the current environment to really stand back and think about how things are really going. You know, I'm a philosopher by training, and I think that actually adds a bit to the conversation. And on that vein, I wanted to try and unpick with you the critical question of what the Fed is really up to and link it to a really interesting debate that's going on at the moment about inflation or deflation. You may remember in a couple of shows back, we discussst, you know, is the future inflationary or deflationary? And there's been a lot of action on that. You know, you had Steve Van Meter on, I spoke to Steve, and there's a really interesting polarization out there as to what's going on. But I want to try and get to that. But let's start with the Fed basically a few weeks ago said we're going to target higher levels of inflation, right? A lot of jawboning. But what do you think they're really thinking?
Well, I believe they know they're relatively impotent from a standpoint of having a direct impact on asset prices, which I think is their only game. I think they recognize the economy is built on asset prices or asset bubbles, debt and confidence. And so they have to instill confidence, and it's a game of expectations. I don't think the Fed, I know the Fed doesn't have direct control over the stock market. As of yet, they're not buying stocks, and who knows what they'll do in the future. I wouldn't put it past them. And yes, I think they can have quite a bit of control over the actions of the market participants from a standpoint of they'll say, okay, we'll come in and backstop the junk debt market by setting up these special purpose vehicles and buying junk debt as an example. And all of a sudden you see the market go up. But the Fed didn't buy that much junk debt to correspond directly with how much prices went up. So the market participants had to take an action there. At the end of the day, the Fed can really do one thing, and that's just create bank reserves. So they're dependent upon other people taking an action. Therefore, their game, and I think they understand this well, is all about psychology. It's all about expectations. And if they want to create inflation, they've got to do that by trying to trick the market into thinking that the Fed has all this power, that they're the wizard that's just going to wave this magic wand. And oh my gosh, the Fed is going to let inflation run hot. Well, we better go out there and we better get moving. We better buy assets. We better go further out the risk curve. We better buy equities. We better pile into all these things because the Fed is going to create inflation. When they forget that the Fed has been saying this for a decade, 12 years now? And why is it, if the Fed is so powerful and if they're so good at doing their job, then why is it that we're still even talking about 2% inflation? By this time, we should have been up to 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10% inflation. Now, a lot of people would argue that we are, but I'm just talking about, let's just shelf that for a moment. Even measuring inflation through the CPI, the way the government and the Fed measure inflation, we should still be up north of 5% if all of their policies actually worked and if they were so powerful. But the bottom line is they aren't. And I think they know that. And unless they change the Federal Reserve Act or they just completely ignore it, which I think they will moving forward, then we're kind of stuck in this Japanification, whether they like it or not. And it's just so blatantly obvious. Every single time they come out with a press conference and Jerome Powell says something, if you just look at it through the lens of them, of their only tool being a manipulation of psychology, then everything he says makes complete sense, and everything they do makes complete sense. I was listening to a fantastic podcast, one of my favorites. It's called Making Sense, and it's with Jeff Snyder, a real good buddy of mine, and Emil Kalinowski, both great guys. And they had on another good buddy of mine named Brent Johnson. And they were talking about the Fed and kind of, how they play this sleight of hand and all of these tricks. And Jeff was talking about how a conference he went to in New York, where he was a speaker. This was maybe, this was prior to COVID. So it would have been, I think, around December. So because it was just after the repo spike and that whole catastrophe where the Fed had to come in and the interest rates in the repo market spiked up over 10% momentarily. And that would have collapsed the entire system, by the way. But it was right around that time. And in this, at the speaking engagement, there was a couple people there from the Fed. And one of them was a young guy, and this guy came up to Jeff. Jeff was telling the story, and he started talking to him. He said, "Jeff, listen, I was at the Fed, this was maybe a month after the repo debacle, and he's like, no one there knows what's going on. They don't understand this." And this person was kind of new at the Fed, and he said that one day, right after that repo happened, the so-called September 20th or so, that Jerome Powell actually came in and said, "Okay, guys, don't worry about this. We're going to do X, Y, and Z, and we're going to take care of the problem." But he never addressed what the problem was. And they kind of just, the guy in the back raising his hand, the new college student that doesn't know that you shouldn't ask questions, says, "Hey, Jerome, by the way, what happened there?" And he's like, "Oh, well, don't worry about that. We'll handle it. Just don't you worry." And this kid was telling Jeff that story, and that actually happened. And so it just goes to show you that they don't know what's going on, and they're just completely reactionary. But I think they do know enough to know they don't know what's going on. They know what they don't know. And the only thing they do have control over is just expectations. And they do have the advantage of the media brainwashing us for the last 20, 30 years since Greenspan. "Oh, don't worry about it. You got the Fed put. Oh, don't worry about it. Don't fight the Fed." That's what Jeff and Brent were talking about. And it totally makes sense that once you get behind the curtain and you see what's really going on back there, you're like, wait a minute. Okay, we really don't have any control. So unless we want the S to hit the fan, then we need to come out here and more job owning, to your point. We need to pretend as though we're all powerful and we can just create inflation just like that, because then we know CNBC and BBC and Bloomberg, and they're all just going to run with the story. And that's going to make market participants hopefully do what we want them to do. So I think that's kind of where they are. And that's how I think, if you look at it from that standpoint, from a game theory, you're able to kind of, I think, better place odds on what the probabilities are of XYZ happening in the future.
Right. I nearly called this one the mythology of the Fed, because you've hit the nail right on the head there, right? I've had the view for some time, central banks around the world are basically perpetuating a series of myths about their ability to do things.
Yeah.
And every time they stand in front of the cameras, all the media just suck it and then play it back, and it gets reported all around the world. I don't think that they're actually particularly in control, because the levers they've got are very limited. They're almost out of smoke. If you look at what happened in Europe, if you look at what's happened in Japan, those are very important case studies. And, I don't see any evidence that any of the central banks around the world know anything different than what they've tried. And it's not working. And my question to you then, George, is, do we need central banks?
I don't think so. I don't think that there's, you'd have to have a transition period there. You can't just say, okay, tomorrow we're not having the central bank anymore. You know what? Going back to that podcast with Jeff and Brent, I want to give them as much credit as I possibly can. They just really had a brilliant line at the end of that podcast. And it was something to the effect that, how will we know that there's truly been an economic recovery in the United States? And Jeff's conclusion was that if no one knows the name of the central banker, or no one knows the name of the Fed chair, then you know the economy is doing well, truly doing well. Because, and it makes so much sense, right? I mean, I remember when I was growing up in the 1980s, I mean, you didn't know who the chairman of the Federal Reserve was. I mean, who knew, who even cared, you know, in college and whatnot? Like, you know, you kind of hear the name Alan Greenspan every once in a while, but you don't care. You don't know what he does. But nowadays, that figurehead is just the most important person on the planet. Like, every single time they talk, like, everyone is just in silence, just glued to the TV screen, just trying to decipher every single one of their words and everything that comes out of their mouth. That in and of itself shows you how broken the economy actually is. Because if we had a true free market, a healthy free market economy, it really wouldn't matter what the Fed was doing. I mean, you think that through. If the economy was truly healthy, from a standpoint of we were these SMEs that we were just talking about in our earlier discussion, that these small and mid-sized businesses, if they're out there creating jobs, if they're creating more goods and services, if they're increasing productivity, if we had Schumpeter's creative destruction, if all of these things were happening, and they raised interest rates by 25 basis points, from, let's say, 6% to 6.25%. Okay, anyway, like seriously, like no one would even bat an eye. Like they wouldn't even pay any attention to it. Like it wouldn't matter. But now, of course, and I think it's because the economies are so fragile and that they're not healthy, that every single 10 basis point move or 25 basis point move by the Fed is just front page news, because that could be the catalyst that just tanks the economy. And you think back to when they were doing QT, they meaning the Fed, and they're trying to unwind their balance sheet, which was supposed to be like paint drying. Remember that, Martin? Oh, don't worry. It's just going to be like watching paint dry. Yeah, right. Until interest rates got up to I think the 10-year got up to 2.25 or something like that. And all of a sudden, the stock market starts crashing. We start seeing this meltdown everywhere. And they're like, oh, sorry about that. Let's drop interest rates real fast. And now that we're in this kind of COVID mode, we just think that, it's just not too far back, that's kind of the catalyst to this downtrend or the most recent downtrend that we've had in interest rates. But no, the Fed was dropping interest rates way prior to COVID. And so again, like we said in our last discussion, that the COVID is just kind of that's the straw that broke the camel's back. The economy was structurally flawed long before COVID. And I agree with a lot of the experts out there that I talk to that say really the economy was broken during the GFC. Leading up to that, the GFC, it was just just showed us how bad and how broken it was, but it's never been fixed. It's never been fixed. And until we get a completely new monetary system, you're not going to have a quote unquote full recovery. So in order of progression, you need to have a completely new monetary system where, and I don't know, it can be completely reliant upon the commercial banks, meaning the money supply and extension of credit to consumers and to businesses. I don't know if that model will work moving forward, but you've got to have a different model. If you have a different model, and it's got to be a bottoms-up type approach, this isn't going to come from a central planner, I can tell you that. But assuming that you do have that new system, Then you've got the healthy economy that's built on that new system. And then the last step, like they were saying, is no one would know who on earth is in charge of the Fed, and they wouldn't even know the Fed exists. So I guess going back to your original question, what would happen if we banned the Fed, or should we ban the Fed? Yeah, I think we should. I think it would be great, and I think it'll happen naturally if and when we're able to go back to having a structurally sound economy, banking system, and some way to create money and additional credit that's actually healthy.
Yeah, and there's two observations I've got off the back of that, because I'm on your page as well. The first is, of course, politicians quite like to be able to sort of pass the buck over to the Fed and say it's their problem, not our problem. So quite often the politicians aren't actually doing the things they should be doing and blame somebody else. The second point is, clearly what you're suggesting really is that capitalism really doesn't exist at the moment.
Not even close. Not even close. And so I've tried to use different terminology lately, because capitalism is getting such a bad rap in the United States. You got all these riots and looting, and fortunately, I don't think you guys have to deal with that too much down in Australia. But here in the U.S., it's really a problem. I mean, it's getting quite scary here. But it's all about capitalism. The greedy capitalists and capitalism. It's late stage capitalism, and we need a new system to come in and take all these assets from the capitalists. And look at what the Fed is doing. This is pure capitalism. It'll never work. And look at what the government. And look at, they're propping up American Airlines. They're propping up Boeing. They're propping up all these companies that should fail. Look at this example of why capitalism doesn't work. And you and I know that's not capitalism. It's the opposite of capitalism. The whole point of capitalism is you've got to allow businesses and individuals to actually fail. And that's like Milton Friedman always says, the loss is just as important, if not more important, than the actual profit. But we're not doing that. So they're trying to really prop up. What's interesting too is they're not only propping up all these entities, but it seems like they're trying to prop up society as well. In this, from the standpoint of we're not allowing anyone to feel any pain. But I don't want to completely go down that rabbit hole. But my point is, I'm trying to not use the term capitalism, or at least use it with the term free market. Free market capitalism, because then it really starts to make sense. And it's tough to argue for that centralized approach or blaming capitalism for what the Fed's doing when you use the word free market, because you say, well, look at what the Fed's doing. They're intervening. They're propping up American Airlines. Look at what happens when you have a free market. You're like, well, wait a minute here. No, that's obviously not a free market. If you're talking about the Fed intervening, then it's much more obvious that that's not a free market solution. So I think if we start to adjust our terminology, that might help the average person that might not watch your YouTube channel or my YouTube channel see that when the government has all these interventions, and when the Fed comes in and they try to muck up the whole system, then that is the opposite of free markets, and that's not what we want. And there's no way that we're going to build a sustainable long-term solution if we don't have private property rights, rule of law, and free markets.
Well, it comes back to some fundamental values, isn't it? And what is society about? What the basis of society is? Who society is for? I mean, those are really important questions, right? And I think we do have lost the plot a little bit insofar that some of those interventions, which may on the surface look reasonable to try and protect jobs, are actually just creating a bigger problem down the track. And one of my observations is a lot of the stuff that's being done is very tactical in nature rather than actually taking a more strategic view. I guess the other question I've got then is, if we're arguing that the interventionist approach from the Fed is actually not working, which it probably isn't, and that we've looked at places like Japan and the Eurozone where they've been at it longer, where does that take us back to that inflation-deflation debate? Because there are a lot of people who are really absolutely rabid about inflation is definitely going to be the future. Where do you stand on that?
Well, I kind of agree with both parties on this. So I'll separate it into like the bond king, our buddy Steve Van Meter, and Brent Johnson, maybe Dr. Lacey Hunt, and then other people like my good friends Lynn Alden and Luke Groman. And I agree with both of them, but you've got to understand the nuance of their argument, right? If the system stays the way it is right now, and we just stay frozen in the way they're doing, they meaning the central banks, then I'm a deflationist. Yeah, I would see some prices rising. Like, I don't think there's any way that you're going to have prices at the grocery store go down. There's no way that's going to happen. So I don't know that I'd be a deflationist, but more so maybe a disinflation. It's like this kind of gradually grind down lower, while some prices, like consumer prices, are actually going up. But
and that's what Japan. That's what Japan has experienced. Exactly what Japan has experienced.
Exactly. So you'd see a Japanification type thing. Yep. But I believe, like, I think, I don't want to put words in Lynn's mouth or Luke's mouth, but I think that they'll change the system, because they've got 900 PhDs at the Fed, and obviously I'm not a big fan of their level of competency, but I would think that at a certain point they'd say, okay, let's take 2 or 3 of these PhDs and have them analyze Japan and have them analyze Europe, and I want to report back to me by the end of next week, you telling me, with all these resources we have at our disposal, why couldn't Japan create inflation? You tell me. And then so if the report comes back that, well, they did everything they could within the system they had to operate, well, then the conclusion you would have to draw was, okay, well, we need a new system. We need a way to get around the system. And what Japan did is they kind of were the guinea pig, right? And then Europe came in behind Japan, and they said, okay, well, we'll do the exact same thing, but we listen to all these Keynesians like Krugman, and they just say, well, Japan did the right thing, but they just didn't do enough of it. So we'll just do what Japan did, but we'll just try to do more of it. So Draghi comes out and says, we'll do whatever it takes, and we're going to create this inflation, whatever. And then that doesn't work out. So then the Fed comes in, and they have these 2 models to look at, these 2 examples. So I mean, again, I don't have a lot of confidence in their level of competency, but I can't imagine that they can't figure out a way to create inflation when they look at Japan and now look at Europe, but confined to the system that they have to live within right now. I don't know that it's possible, because they don't have a direct transfer mechanism, number one, to increase the money supply and the real economy that are chasing those goods and services, but also they don't have a way to increase velocity. That's really a problem, because velocity, in my opinion, has a lot to do with psychology, and with the confidence level of the average person and the society at large. A lot to do with demographics as well. And so you've got to have these animal spirits, if you will, in the real economy. And how do you create that? Like, how do you create that from a tops-down approach? Very, very difficult to do, if not impossible. I think the Japanese would probably say, hey, it's impossible in our population, because we gave out UBI, we gave out stimulus, we took our debt to GDP to 225%, and we still couldn't get these crazy people to spend. They just took the stimulus checks and paid down debt and put it into their savings account or whatever. So at the end of the day, you're still reliant on those people. And if you don't have that psychological shift, then you don't get the velocity necessary. So I think it goes back to the Fed creating a Fed coin, and us, the Americans, all having accounts at the Fed so they can just create bank reserves, which right now is really the only thing they can do. When we talk about the tools that the Fed has at their disposal, it's really one thing only, other than the psychology stuff. It's just to create bank reserves and to give these banks in the commercial banking system additional balance sheet capacity. Once they have the additional balance sheet capacity to go loan, then it's up to them to go into the market and produce these loans. And then it's up to the consumers and the entrepreneurs to have demand for those loans in the first place. So like we said in our last talk, it's that supply-demand equation for the loans. So just the simple fact of the Fed increasing bank reserves to a quadrillion, let's say, doesn't necessarily mean that we have any additional lending or we have any additional money supply. Now, you could argue there'd have to be some sort of spillover, but technically you could see how it would work. That doesn't necessarily have to there doesn't necessarily have to be this direct causal effect of taking bank reserves up to some astronomical number and still not have it, really not have too much of an effect over the inflation. So I think what most people need to realize is that's really the discrepancy between the argument. I mean, that's why everyone is so respectful with one another. You're dealing with high class people, but of great character, I think. But also, too, they understand that, hey, Lynn would be the first person to admit that Brent and Steve are totally right. And I think that they would admit that Luke and Lynn are totally right. They just have a different belief system, or they looked at the game theory behind what will most likely happen in the future, and that's where they're coming to a different conclusion. If they look at the way the system is structured, I think they all see it pretty much the same way, with a few exceptions. I think if you look at the Federal Reserve Act, there's some wiggle room there on how the Federal Reserve Act might be interpreted by individual parties. But that's really what you're dealing with. So as far as where I fall, it's kind of a long-winded answer here. I think that the Fed will look at everything around them, and they'll go to this digital currency to try to inject money directly into the system without having to rely on the banking system. And I think they'll use it to increase velocity, because what they'll do is they'll do it through UBI, and they'll give you a time frame where you have to spend that money within 30 days. And if you don't spend it within 30 days, then poof, it's gone from your phone or gone from your account. So obviously people are going to go out there and spend it. And if by chance they don't have enough velocity with that, well, then you just say 15 days or 10 days or whatever. So I think that's going to be their approach to creating inflation. And if they don't take that approach, and they just look at Japan and Europe and just try to do the same thing but more of it, I mean, that's truly the definition of insanity.
Yes, well, you do the same thing and expect a different outcome. That doesn't tend to work very well, right? And you, I think, have made a really important point, which is there is a fundamental frame of reference within which people think and operate, right? And often people don't question the fundamentals that are driving what they're doing. And that really is quite important now, because I don't believe that the current mode of operation of the Fed is going to take us anywhere useful. It'll just go around in circles, right? The question is, do they have the intestinal fortitude to stand back and do what you've suggested, which is say, yeah, we recognize that, we need to find a different way? Or will they just muddle on through, right, and say, well, hasn't worked so far, but if we increase the volume of stimulus into the system, that's surely going to have a different effect.
And by the way, if I would suggest for your viewers and listeners that in the future, especially in the next 6 months, if we come into another downturn because of the virus or shutdowns or whatever, watch the language of the Federal Reserve. I can almost guarantee you that it's going to get more and more extreme until or if we come to a point where they actually create these accounts where they can monitor, or they can turn bank reserves into legal tender, which is what Dr. Lacey Hunt talks about. But until that time, the language is going to become more and more over the top. It's going to go from, okay, we're going to let inflation run hot, to you better watch out, we're going to double-digit inflation. We're going to, by 2030, we're going to target double-digit inflation. It's just going to get more and more extreme because they know that's the only thing they can do. And at some point, you got to say, do the people realize that they're just crying wolf, right? At some point, does the market wise up to this and be like, wait a minute here. The Fed's been talking about this for 12 years, and now they're talking about inflation running hot. And according to their CPI, we still haven't got up to 2%. And now they're talking about inflation at double digits, but we're not even at 2% yet. And nothing they have done has ever worked. And that's when you could really see some downside in the stock market, especially, is if they stop believing that the Fed has these powers, and if they realize the emperor has no clothes.
Well, I mentioned in the other show with you, Alice in Wonderland. I do believe that's the environment that we're in at the moment, where in fact, anything is not quite the way it really looks. And so expect more of that spruiking, expect more of the media just blandly reporting what they're saying and sort of propagating that. But frankly, I think it's time for a bit of disruption, a bit of change, and hopefully a new Fed or a no Fed in the future.
I think you made a very good point there about the media, and I think they play right into the Fed's game for sure. I don't know if you saw what happened to me with the BBC. But did you see that?
No, tell me. Yeah.
So the BBC just the other day came out with this story. It was on it wasn't the BBC directly. It was a show on their station, on the network or whatever. And the show, this half-hour episode, was about misinformation on YouTube. Ironically enough, right? And so I did a whiteboard video on the World Economic Forum and this great reset that they're talking about. And this guy Klaus Schwab, who runs the World Economic Forum, he's straight out of a Bond movie as far as being a villain from Spectre or something like that. In fact, in my whiteboard video, I drew him with Mr. Bigglesworth. That Dr. Evil cat that he had, But, so they have this great reset where it's this total central planning type nonsense, this tops down. But my point is every single item, every data point that I got from my whiteboard video, I took it straight from their website, directly from their website. And from a couple YouTube videos that were on their YouTube channel where they were talking about how we could get to this great reset, and they call it a fourth industrial revolution, right? And so everything was straight from their website, bottom line. So the BBC, the show, they used that episode or that whiteboard video that I did as an example of dangerous misinformation that exists on YouTube, and how if you're watching YouTube, you should really be careful, because you could run across one of these channels that's secretly trying to brainwash you into believing all of these things aren't true, and to where you're going to make all these mistakes, and you're going to, who knows, you're going to vote for Donald Trump, or not that I'm pro-Trump, but you're going to vote for Brexit, or who knows what you're going to do. And the irony, of course, is that they didn't even look into the backstory of the video. They just saw the title and they thought, well, that sounds sensational, but they didn't realize that it's coming straight from their website. But my point there is, yes, we've talked about the Fed, and it's crucial that your viewers and listeners understand how to read the Fed speak, if you will. But you need to do the same thing with the media, because the media is going to be perpetuating this nonsense from the Fed and from the World Economic Forum and all of these people, and you're going to be bombarded with it. So you really have to understand what's going on to have this barrier to sift through all the BS.
No, totally right. And one of the reasons why DFA exists is because we didn't think that there were enough diverse voices, right? So, we don't tend to take a very strong view. What we do is to try and put different points of view up so people can make better decisions on their own behalf, rather than just swallowing the headline, right? And I think that's probably the most, philosophically speaking, the most fundamental issue at the moment, right? We have to help people to be able to actually make better, more objective, more independent decisions, rather than just swallowing holus bolus, the stuff that comes out through various sort of mainstreams. And then, of course, as you say, quite often they'll turn around and say, oh, well, that's misinformation or disinformation, because it doesn't fit with their model of the world. And go back to my frame of reference, right? Everybody has a frame of reference, right? like it or not, everybody does. But very few people question what that frame of reference is and why it's the way it is and what the basic assumptions are underpinning it, right? That's what we have to do, because actually as soon as you start stepping back one more step and thinking about that, you realize some of the limitations possibly of the own way that you've got of thinking about the world, and recognize that there are other people with different frames of reference. But unless you understand that they're coming from a different point of view, you're never going to be able to actually engage. And that's part of what we're trying to do here.
That's right. That's right.
George, I appreciate your time today. Great to talk with you again. If people want to find out more about you, where do they go?
Well, they can go to my YouTube channel. They can go to my Twitter. It's all George Gammon. My last name is Gammon.
I really appreciate your time, George. Take care, and we'll talk again soon, I'm sure.
All right. Thanks, Martin.